He was most at odds with the ideology of the rest of Les Six, and later in life, he developed a pessimism that mutated into concerns about the end of civilization itself. Seriously, his little book here, it's kind of depressing. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Arthur Honegger. Although Honegger is regarded as a Swiss composer, he was born in France, in the city of Le Havre, in March 1892. His parents were Swiss, which gave Arthur Swiss citizenship, which he maintained throughout his life, but he was not Swiss by birth. Le Havre, which was up in Normandy, was so far away from the Parisian hub of musical culture that Arthur later called it one of the least musical cities imaginable. His exposure to music was in opera, and when he was 11, he decided he was going to write a grand opera called Philippa. The work of Richard Wagner was a strong influence, as was the chamber music of Beethoven. Arthur was ambitious and had some local instruction, but he still didn't know what a proper fugue was, as evidenced by his 6 violin sonatas of 1908, written in a set of 6 because that's what the early Baroque masters did. He was self-taught at first, learning basic theory by playing through Beethoven's piano sonatas, which led him to writing his own sonatas and getting his mom to play them. Beethoven wasn't Arthur's only Germanic compositional model. The most important was J.S. Bach, whom he considered his definitive model. When he was 15, he heard a few Bach cantatas and was so moved by them that he abandoned another opera and began writing an oratorio instead. When he was 17, he took a summer vacation to Zurich, and there he stayed with his uncle, who convinced his parents to let him stay there on a more permanent basis to study at the conservatory in Zurich. Later in life, he would consider his father as something of a hero who supported him in music, even though he had 3 other mouths to feed aside from him. Now, Switzerland is an unusual country in a lot of ways, but specifically, it doesn't have one language. It has 4 official languages, and they're spread out all over the country. There's a group of Swiss folks who speak Italian, French, a dialect of German known as Swiss German, and then a small portion of the population which speak Latin's closest living relative, a language known as Romansh. These linguistic areas influence the culture within those areas, which is why Zurich, in the German-speaking area, would be so influenced by German composers and not French composers. Honegger studied for 2 years there, and when that course of study was over, his father offered him a position in the family coffee importing business. Honegger said no. Instead, he followed the advice of the Zurich Conservatory's director, Friedrich Hegar, and enrolled at the Paris Conservatoire under the auspices of the well-liked Gabriel Fauré. There, he met Germain Théafer and Darius Milhaud. Milhaud took Honegger under his wing and introduced him to the best of the more minor French composers that Honegger would otherwise never know of, and they became good friends despite their strong differences in opinion. Unique to Honegger as an influence among the eventual members of Les Six was Fernand Hoxé, a polymath whose disappearance during World War II left Honegger distraught. Honegger went to Paris in this strongly Germanic tradition, and while he was able to bring modernist scores of Bela Bartok and Arnold Schoenberg back to his friends, they also introduced him to everything that was going on in French music, especially Claude, Debussy, and César Franck. Debussy and Franck were 2 very different composers in a lot of respects, with Debussy representing the iconoclastic break from tradition, and Franck the epitome of academic French Romanticism. Honegger wrote in 1915 that French composers contained more feeling than their Germanic counterparts. Max Reger, for instance, was someone Honegger initially admired, but soon thought abused technical procedures to hide a lack of imagination. Reger was a big name in the Swiss regions, but practically a no-name in Paris. What we see in Honegger's works from the 2nd decade of the century onward is a synthesis of these very different styles. What underpins his work is an emphasis on the German aspects of music, strong musical architecture, clarity of counterpoint, structure. While still a student, Honegger was clumped together with other young composers known as the New Youths, composers that would eventually become members of Les Six and some other ones as well, which is really ironic because Honegger didn't write the same music that they did. He left the Conservatoire in 1918 on good terms with the faculty after losing the counterpoint competition to another student named Andrea Vadebourg, a piano student who had already premiered several of Honegger's pieces. Keep her name in mind, she'll be coming back in a few minutes. One of the odd things about this era of music history is that if you wanted to get famous overnight, the best way to do this was to incite a riot. Igor Stravinsky had done this with his Rite of Spring, and Erik Satie had done this with Parade, while in America, George Antheil tried to do the same thing to generate press. Honegger got this reaction to his stage work, I hesitate to call it a ballet because it's not totally a ballet, Les Dignes des Jeux du Monde, which is not the only piece from Les Six to deal with the creation of the world. Suddenly, it seemed like everyone in Paris wanted Honegger to write music for them, a really good problem to have. Honegger ended up backing into the group of Les Six almost by accident, you could interpret. He, of course, contributed a piece to the collected album of Les Six, and then in 1920, he and Warburg premiered his violin sonata at Milhaud's apartment, and sure enough, he was name-dropped in Henri Collet's early 1920 article naming the old members of the New Youths as Les Six. Collet believed that Honegger was the most profound member of this group. Of the many ways that members of the group could differentiate themselves from one another, Honegger did so along many more lines than would usually be found among any two members. His aesthetic decisions were just very different, and it was because he had this Germanic background. He was at odds with the other members even more than Louis Duret, who had went so far as to quit the group in 1921. Honegger was the only member of Les Six to make his name as a symphonic composer, writing 5 symphonies. Maybe a better question is, why was he a member of Les Six? And the answer is that he was strongly anti-impressionistic. And he was anti-impressionistic because he leaned into the tradition. He leaned into musical architecture, and he leaned into this influence from Bach, Beethoven, and beyond. He justified his use of this tradition as a necessary continuation of musical tradition, not simply cutting off a branch from the tree. He was the only member of the group to dislike the music of Erik Satie and enjoy the music of Ludwig van Beethoven, saying that he didn't care for the kinds of low and middle brown musics the rest of Les Six did. Instead, he positioned himself as writing the music that Bach might have written if he lived in an era of poly and atonality. He was also a proponent in his own way of Richard Wagner's use of the dominant chord as a driving force throughout all of his music. No matter how resolutive a chord sounds, it can always be used as a preparation for a new chord that sounds even more resolutive, a continuous cascade of dominant harmonies. Nonetheless, throughout the 1920s, Honegger showed off the ways in which he was similar to Les Six by writing a series of works with diatonic phrasing, simple tunes, and popular melodies, which show his willingness to engage with the French vernacular. Although Honegger rightly had reservations about being roped into a group of composers whose aesthetics differed so greatly from his own, he did have a great working relationship with Jean Cocteau, and contributed to what was, until Duret quit, going to be their second collaborative effort, The Wedding Party at the Eiffel Tower. Milhaud noted that Honegger's contribution was the only number in the whole ballet that the press took seriously. One of his most significant pieces, 1921's King David, worked both as incidental music for René Maurax's play and, shorn from staging, an oratorio in its own right that Honegger called a symphonic psalm. Honegger, who was commissioned by Maurax on Stravinsky's advice, somehow wrote this piece in 2 months, combining all sorts of styles in a way that worked and gained great popularity, juxtaposing old and new from movement to movement. Keep in mind that Honegger's Swiss origins meant that he was the only member of Les Six with a strongly Protestant background. France was historically a Catholic country, and Milhaud was the only other exception as the only Jewish member. Honegger was, at the same time, in high demand as a composer of incidental music, and having to weather attacks in the press for his differences between him and the rest of Les Six. Probably due to, because Louis Duret quit the group, the press viewed Les Six as more ideologically coherent than it actually was. Honegger understood his music as rooted in tradition, and embracing the tougher road of economy of means, as opposed to the simpler route of iconoclasm and naivete that he saw in Erik Satie. Regardless, he was good friends with Milhaud, who, in many ways, was the most Satie-esque of Les Six. Composers who get an internationally famous premiere can sometimes be so overwhelmed by it that they can strike out on their next turn at bat, but Honegger hit a home run instead. In 1923, he followed up King David with a piece called Mouvement Symphonique, which was later retitled Pacific 231. Honegger loved trains, and it sounds like a train, and it's named after a train, but Honegger understood his work as something more than just a piece that sounds like a train. He carefully constructed it to accelerate rhythmically while decelerating in tempo. Honegger saw parallels between its mathematical precision in these areas and the way that Bach would have written a chorale prelude. In this piece, tonality takes a backseat to rhythm in a manner reminiscent of early Soviet-era futurists who wanted to encode the sound of factories in their orchestral works to honor the proletariat. But we're getting off track here. King David was still quite popular, and Morax wanted a hit sequel, and so he commissioned Honegger to write this sequel with him. And this was the opera Judith, a tale pulled not from the biblical canon, but from a set of books known as the Apocrypha, of different theological importance between Jews and different branches of Christianity. Instead of an episodic structure, Honegger cast it as a singular drama. For many reasons, it wasn't as much of a hit, and Honegger learned his lesson and scaled back later collaborations. This piece probably wouldn't merit that much of a mention if not for its mezzo-soprano lead, Claire Kreuzer, whose new music specializations post-World War I led her to performing a lot of Honegger's works and eventually carrying on a romance with him, while Honegger was romantically entangled to Andrea Warburg. Honegger married Warburg in 1926, within a month of his son Claude's birth, by Claire Kreuzer. And the couple's marital situation was unorthodox. They lived separately because Honegger required complete solitude for his work. And I mean solitude. Francis Poulenc said that he went by, but he saw on Honegger's door, "Do not disturb," in no less than 60 languages. He ignored calls and the doorbell. And when he was shuttered in, he didn't just stay at his desk or piano. He would walk around, ruminate. He just didn't want to be disturbed by anybody. Warburg kept her last name, or hyphenated it, and she would continue her career as a pianist and a teacher. She, having gotten first prize in counterpoint, was still unsurprisingly very good at it, and at one point she would turn out to be Pierre Boulez's counterpoint teacher. Honegger was also a conductor, and so this took out even more of his precious compositional time, but he did have time to continue to collaborate on big operas and stage works. In the late 1920s, he collaborated with Jean Cocteau on an opera, Antigone. This piece uses atonality and upends traditional French text setting in a way that Honegger thought was really quite groundbreaking. He thought of it as his greatest work, and solidifying its avant-garde bona fides was Pierre Boulez, who called it a touchstone, a jumping-off point for his generation. Antigone is paced quite strangely for a music drama. Cocteau knew that this form needed to compete with newer forms of art like film, so he drastically sped up the action. Honegger's choice of handling the text is quite interesting, because on the one hand you had this extreme melisma style, these really long open vowels of the Italian bel canto tradition where one word can last for multiple pages. And on the other extreme you had the example of Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande, and its rapid speech-like continuous recitative. Honegger believed that the unintelligibility of the bel canto style was the fault of the composer, but then again, that style of opera isn't really about understanding every word. He also felt like the Debussy imitators were screwing up opera because they were robbing it of its drama. Honegger's solution? He took the bel canto technique of really laying it on the vowels, and he flipped that on its head. Instead, he really laid it on the consonant. This meant that in lieu of the traditional French text setting, where the emphasis goes on the second syllable, Honegger put the emphasis on the first syllable. He compared it to a locomotive dragging the rest of the word behind it. Yeah, this dude really loved trains and cars. He had pictures of them all over the top of his desk, and he said that he loved them as other men did women. This experiment, combined with its atonal language, meant that even though he thought it contributed something to the lyric theater, it never took off. Like Richard Strauss, Honegger was weirded out that French was sung differently than it was spoken. He understood this as French composers being more concerned with melody than making their texts understandable. Singers would tend to push back on this consonant-forward approach initially, but would eventually come around to it once they got the hang of it. It became natural to them. He also made sure that his meaning was pushed forward by focusing in on one or two key words in a phrase or a sentence, and really making sure he hammered those home. So even if you missed some other things in there, you made sure that you got the important words. Beyond opera, he followed up his first movement symphonique with a second one, which he entitled Rugby, and contrasted its structural techniques with Pacific 231. He would later write a third Movement Symphonique, only to neglect to give it a more interesting title, making it far and away the least played and least known of the triptych. This orchestral focus made Honegger a prime candidate for a symphonist, and led Serge Koussevitzky of the Boston Symphony to commission Honegger's Symphony No. 1. Honegger always seemed at home in the orchestra and working in various dramatic forms, which tracks with his stated desire that, all else being equal, he'd rather have composed nothing but opera. Operetta was also included, and Honegger moved towards more lighthearted works, just as the rest of Les Six were moving towards more seriously minded works. In the early 1930s, Honegger noted, somewhat ironically given his background, a growing distaste for his music in Germany. Concert performances of his works were banned when Hitler came to power, which Honegger saw as concerning on a lot of different levels. For one thing, it was one more barrier that prevented composers from making a living in their profession. Opera to Honegger was a dead form. If composers really wanted to engage in a medium like that, they had to write film music. Now, Georges Erik was making buckets of money from his film scores, especially after World War II, so this wasn't a novel idea to anybody in Les Six. Honegger turned to film work and duly cranked them out, but he always said that this was more because he needed the money than because he actually liked doing it. The fact that Honegger, who had achieved international fame in the 1920s, was complaining about the state of being able to make money in music is quite striking. Part of the issue is that performances of King David and Pacific 231 ebbed as the Great Depression made putting on these big pieces a lot harder. Honegger adapted to the need for a more economical form of music, and he embraced the technology of his day, specifically an early electronic instrument known as the onde maintenon, which is more associated with Olivier Messiaen, which Honegger believed was a suitable replacement for the contrabassoon. When World War II broke out, Honegger had the option, given his Swiss citizenship, to escape to neutral Switzerland and ride the war out there. But he chose not to do this. And when the war was over and Honegger dared say something nice about a German composer, all of a sudden he was faced with the prospect of not just not having his works played in Berlin, but also not having his works played in Paris. It's not quite as simple as just that, because a looming question for this era was, what constituted artistic collaboration with the Nazis? Sure, if you had to make a deal with someone who spoke German to make ends meet during the occupation, that was more understandable. But if you went out of your way to profit off of the occupation, well, then you were going to get in big trouble once liberation occurred. Honegger was accused of being a collaborator. He stayed behind under occupation, and he did a lot of what the other French folks, actual French citizens, did, and just tried to make the best of a bad situation if he couldn't get out. In this case, he stayed behind by choice. It was his Swiss citizenship that made him a target to some, and the fact that he was nice to German composers made him even more suspicious. These accusations were not without merit. In November 1941, Honegger was sent to a music festival in the newly annexed Vienna. This festival was organized by the Nazi propaganda ministry, and its most infamous speaker was the head of the Nazi propaganda machine, Joseph Goebbels, who spoke of Mozart as a symbol of Europe and of a collaboration between France and Germany specifically. This is historically just baffling to me, but the Nazis weren't known for being historically accurate. Honegger knew the optics of this, and he distanced himself from the optics of the festival, but how can you distance yourself from the festival when the festival itself was organized by the Nazis? The catch-22 was that Honegger defended himself by saying, hey, I draw a line between music and politics, but standing on that wedge put him firmly on the side of Nazi propaganda, because their propaganda was so insidious that they said, well, if you're apolitical, you must be on the side of our music, because our music, that is German music, is universal. Milhaud believed that his old friend wasn't truly a collaborationist at heart, that he just made some really dumb decisions. Honegger had, after all, been part of the musical arm of the French resistance, but after some episodes like this, they decided to kick him out in 1943, and that deeply hurt him. Milhaud was willing to continue his friendship with Honegger, but Milhaud, being stuck in the United States for the duration of the war, knew that it was not his place to be casting judgment on those who stayed behind and tried to do their best. Poulenc, for his part, said that Honegger was not guilty of being a collaborator, but Poulenc was known to make excuses for pretty much anyone who was accused of collaboration, so make all of this what you will. After the war, there weren't many people who genuinely thought that Honegger was a Nazi sympathizer. There's too much evidence to the contrary, even though he like Milhaud thought, did do some stupid things. This wartime controversy ended with an unofficial 6-month ban of Honegger's music on French soil, although he couldn't be hauled in front of a committee because, again, he wasn't French. Borderline cases like his were small potatoes when you compare to the overall denazification of Europe and the incoming New World Order of big nuclear superpowers vying for supremacy. There was simply too much on Europe's plate to care about folks who may or may not have collaborated a little bit, depending on your definition of where that line is. Honegger was tapped to join the faculty of the École Normale de Musique in 1946, and in 1947 Koussevitzky invited him out to the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts to teach at the Boston Symphony's Summer Tanglewood Festival. He got deathly ill when he got to Tanglewood. It took him months to recover, and he never was back to his peak physical health again. As he got older, he found that it took more and more time to get his brain into gear if it wasn't in the composing rut. Although he would compose and stay active as much as he could towards the end of his life, he progressively got weaker and weaker. And he was the first of Les Six to die in November 1955 at the age of 63. The members of Les Six knew that their little group would no longer be able to have a full reunion. When they got the news, Erik and Taillefer spent hours on the phone crying over the loss of their friend. His style and outlook were not the best fit for what French culture was looking for towards the end of his life, and his advice to younger composers: work in a grocery store instead. He became depressed at the idea of continuing what he felt to be a Sisyphean battle to be a modern composer. He didn't think music, as we know it, would exist for that much longer after his death. He saw the rise of big famous performers or conductors, and he thought that a lot of members of the audience who went to see those particular performances did so almost like they were going to see some big baseball or football star at a sporting event. People who didn't really care about the music, they just wanted to see some famous name do something famous on stage. He knew that audiences weren't interested in new music any more than they had to be. Contemporary composers produced a product for which there was no market. And he really resented the fact that audiences in other arts were always keen on the new, whereas audiences for music only ever wanted the old. This is the kernel of his dislike for Satie, because Satie's fans would often pitch Satie as this great new musical mind, someone who was willing to return to simplicity, someone who was pioneering something new in that process. But Honegger looked at his music and said, this is just a regurgitation of the salon music of the past century. And as far as radios were concerned, well, he just didn't like the fact that music was everywhere, because if music was constantly coming at you from all these different directions, there's no way that you could ever pay attention to music in a concert setting the way it deserved to be treated. Again, we see diametrically opposite Satie, who pursued furniture music. He was the first to come up with this idea of muzak, basically, music to exist in a space and be actively not listened to. So yeah, he was pretty pessimistic about a lot of stuff, but he also knew that there were a lot of artists of his era that were totally worthwhile. He just didn't think the year 2000 would come about without the destruction of all of human civilization. I'm not kidding. He did not think that the next generation would see the year 2000, and not without good reason. I mean, he didn't know how the 20th century was going to turn out, and if it had continued with the kind of unabated violence that had characterized it up until that point, you can see why he would adopt this very negative and nihilistic worldview. He hated the 20th century in comparison to the 19th, which he saw as a much more relaxed, and we might characterize it as libertarian era. He especially hated border guards and all sorts of customs officials. He thought that they just slowed down the dissemination of culture. Like Georges Erik would come to be after Honegger's death, Honegger was a strong proponent for the reinforcement of copyright law. He thought that the life of the author plus 50 years was barely going to be enough, in most cases, for the pieces that composers wrote to turn a profit for their kids and grandkids. He loved collaborating with Paul Claudel, the poet behind his Joan of Arc at the Stake and Dance of the Dead. More than most, Honegger noted, Claudel understood music and could get very specific as to what he wanted. Claudel would employ Darius Milhaud as his attaché during his diplomatic voyages to the Americas in the end of the 19-teens. Honegger and Milhaud agreed that there was a need to use a certain amount of dissonance in their languages, but they differed as to how to use this dissonance. Milhaud embraced polytonality, whereas Honegger Germanic as ever, embraced elements of atonality. He was the most atonally influenced composer of Les Six, but to call him an atonal composer outright is just simply not accurate. He pulled from his tradition in the same way that the French composers of the group pulled from their tradition. He referred to himself as a humble craftsman, even when he otherwise thought quite highly of his achievements. Even his piano music is orchestrally conceived, with detailed and occasionally quite dense contrapuntal writing. He wanted a music that was accessible to general audiences and to connoisseurs. He prized melody, rhythm, and proportion as the driving goals of a piece. For him, harmony was less of a concern because dissonance wasn't actually what drove audiences away from modern music. He condemned modernist composers for trying to put music in a state of permanent revolution, of always trying to upend tradition, because if you're always trying to upend tradition, what are you left with? All the same, he also found an intentional return to harmonic simplicity to also be the wrong way to go. He compared the early serialists to prisoners who escaped only to choose to weigh down their ankles with balls and chains. They confused a means to an end for the end itself. To Honegger, if you were a serial composer, the more serial you were, the less talented you were. He even predicted minimalism because he saw that the overly complex systems of the serialists would inevitably lead to a backlash. Alban Berg was the only exception to Honegger's dislike for the 12-toners because he saw Berg more for his atonality than for his serialism. He liked Messiaen for his creativity and his emphasis on melody, but thought that his modes of limited transposition just slowed him down. It's not like he was just going to roll over and accept that modern audiences didn't like modern music in the way that they used to. He even outlined a plan to UNESCO to make modern music more accessible. He outlined necessary reforms beginning with notation. Much like Obukov and his attempts at reforming the practice, Honegger agreed and went further. He called for a severe reduction in C clefs. He called for the abolition of transposing instruments in scores. And he also was really not a fan of the practice of syllabic beaming. This was just in the more traditional vein. He also called out modernists, and he specifically calls out Messiaen here, for making their scores harder to read. There was this practice of not having the ties of one note that's tied to another note go all the way over, which just made things more confusing to read. And he also didn't like the fact that a lot of composers switched their time signatures up a lot. He thought that this was something that made it more confusing for the performer, that made it less accessible, and that you could get the same effect by just trusting your performers to interpret the piece. For Honegger, the dogma of tonality, the idea that a symphonic piece needed to begin and end in the same place, was outdated. But he also saw the 12-tone technique as trying to paint with all colors equally. Proportion, like architecture, was his primary concern. So, say in sonata form, instead of presenting the themes in the recapitulation in the same order that they were in the exposition, he would flip them around. So if you have A and then B in the exposition, he would come back with B and then A in the recapitulation for a more arch form. He also questioned the practice of multi-instrument sonatas sharing themes between instruments. If you have a violin sonata, why should the violin's theme be transferred into the piano? Symphonies and sonatas were like novels to him. Characters were introduced, and then we follow their development as the piece goes along. Honegger divided composers into two categories. Experimentalists who tried out new techniques, he cites the microtonalists here specifically, and you have the craftsmen who take the things that the experimentalists come up with and make them more expressive. There were those who brought the stones to the building, and those who built the building. He also had some kind of strange takes, like he so distrusted audiences that he thought if the microtonalists got their way, if more quarter tones proliferated in Western music, that eventually audiences would be so blind to what intervals were that they would lose track of the steps. Like, half steps wouldn't sound like anything to them anymore. I doubt, just on an acoustical level, that that could ever happen. Honegger comes across in his writings as misanthropic and an almost depressed character, and his music with its Germanic contrapuntal drive and distinctly non-French influences make him an odd figure when compared to the aesthetics of the rest of Les Six. Regardless of what you think of Les Six, it's likely that you'll have a more nuanced opinion of them the more you listen to what Honegger has to offer.